petrol prices between now and the end of the year. I'm getting an extraordinary number of SMSs and tweets and emails from people in different professions who are constantly asked for free advice. I'll find an opportunity later on in the show to go through some of those. There's some lovely, charming, funny emails and SMSs coming through. But what's not funny or charming in any way, they're just stories. There's me sighing again. They're just stories in this country that I can understand them intellectually, but they just perplex me in the most profound ways. And this story out of KwaZulu-Natal, Sizimela High, where a group of boys kicked, punched and hit an 18-year-old Kumbani in Gabinde with iron knobkerries. They beat him to death. And this was being filmed. And then the video of that, people casually send on. Look at this, they go. It goes viral in that awful phrase, which I hate. And there are just so many things wrong with this. The fact that there's violence on the playground. The fact that people film it instead of trying to stop it. The fact that people so very casually send this gruesome video on. The fact that people, knowing what it is, open it and look at it. One of the emails I got yesterday was from somebody saying he simply doesn't understand why you would want to look at that. And that's my view. I haven't seen it, and I won't look at it. What do I need to look at it for? And then today, front page of the Times, teachers at the school were standing at a staff room window and watching a group of boys do this. They didn't try to stop the fight, which continued for at least 5 minutes, just meters from the staff room and the principal's office at the school. And the education department in KwaZulu-Natal doesn't have any problem with this, saying there was no need for teachers to explain where they were at the time of the attack. They were at school. I don't need to say where in school, said a spokesman. What do you want them to do? In the course of spears being brandished, what do people expect them to do? Even if they ran away, there was nothing wrong with that. And I was reminded that as a young student of psychology many, many years ago, in my first social psychology seminar, I was introduced to the very famous Kitty Genovese case out of New York, where somebody called Kitty Genovese was murdered in the well of an apartment block with literally hundreds of people listening to her screams of despair. And nobody went to her aid. And it is something that psychologists do study. We're on the line, we're joined on the line now from Leicester by Andrew Colman, who's a professor of psychology at Leicester University and a member of the Leicester Decision-Making Lab, I beg your pardon. Andrew Colman, a very good afternoon.
Good afternoon, John.
I understand that you won't know the specific incident to which I'm referring, but in terms of how I described it, the teachers and the boys who were watching this, does that sound to you like the bystander effect?
It sounds like a perfect example of the bystander effect, yes.
And is it about fear of personal safety? What are the dynamics involved in making people stand by rather than intervene?
Well, I mean, this has been known for a long time. It goes back to American researchers in the 1960s. 1968, actually, Bibb Latané and John Darley discovered this. And it was they were triggered into researching it by the Kitty Genovese case that you mentioned, that horrible murder in New York. And they started doing lab experiments and also experiments in real-life settings. And what they found was that when there's an emergency, either somebody in trouble or some violent act, such as the one that you were talking about here, there's a tendency for people to be less likely to offer help or to intervene when there are other people present than when they're on their own. And you ask me what, or should I tell you what the mechanisms seem to be, yes?
Yes, please.
Okay, so there are various reasons. I mean, before you intervene in an emergency, first of all, you've got to notice that something's happening. You've got to realize that it's an emergency. You've got to acknowledge personal responsibility for you acting, and you've got to decide on some suitable action to take, and then you've got to implement it. Now, there are three things that tend to stop people doing this. to a degree at least, when there are other people present. And the first is called audience inhibition, and this is the potential embarrassment if you've misconstrued what's going on. So you try to intervene in what seems to be an emergency, and it turns out it isn't what it seems to be, and you've made a fool of yourself. So if there are other people present, there's audience inhibition. Then the second one is social influence. This is just like conformity pressure. Here are other people who not intervening in this situation. These situations, incidentally, usually there's at least an element of ambiguity, not knowing exactly what's going on. There are other people not intervening, and that tends to influence you in deciding, well, if they're not intervening, I won't intervene. So there's social influence there. And lastly, is that there's what psychologists call diffusion of responsibility, and this is a tendency when there are other people present for people to be less likely to feel personally responsible for giving assistance, more likely to assume that they can't be held personally accountable for failing to intervene because there are other people who could have done. Whereas if you're on your own, you feel, well, dear me, I better take responsibility. So those are the mechanisms, I think, which cause this phenomenon.
And nowhere in there did you say fear of what might happen to me physically if I intervene.
Well, if it's dangerous, as this particular case seems to have been, or at least potentially dangerous, there's somebody committing a violent assault, then of course that's an additional factor. I mean, there's fear of intervening anyway. But I mean, there'd be fear of intervening whether you were a solitary onlooker or in a group, as in this incident. And the fear exists in both cases, but you're even more likely to give in to the fear and say, look, I'm not going to take this risk if there are other people who are also standing by.
No,
if you're on your own, you might think, well, it's dangerous, but I've just got to do something here. If there was one teacher, for example, and there was nobody else there, then the teacher might well have felt, well, this is dangerous, but look, I've just got to do something.
I'm moving now out of academic terrain into the terrain of ethics and morality, which is, a slippery place to be. But does having an academic understanding of how this bystander effect works excuse people in any way morally from culpability in an event like this? Is it a moral excuse for them to be able to say, well, quite obviously I was suffering from the bystander effect? Not in so many words.
That's a very difficult question. I mean, that's a question for a moral philosopher or for a judge in a court case, I guess. But there are precedents for judges in court cases taking it into account in mitigation. So it doesn't relieve you of criminal responsibility if a crime has been committed, but it might relieve you of some degree of culpability in the eyes of the law. But from a philosophical point of view, I mean, it would take a moral philosopher to discuss this, and I think it's a very difficult question. You obviously have quite strong feelings about this, and so do I. But on the other hand, when you learn more about it, you at least can see how it might happen. If it doesn't excuse it, at least helps you to understand it.
Andrew Colman, thank you very, very much indeed. Professor of Psychology at Leicester University and a member of the Leicester Decision Making Lab.
The Money Show, weekday evenings from